Thanks for joining us here at the Master's Apprentice, learning to be like Jesus. My name is Caleb,
And I'm Dustin.
and we're just very thankful that you're tuning in, and we hope that so far that you've been able to check out the previous episodes. We are in a series of thoughts here, talking about how we shape our lives and these tools that we have to be like Jesus. And to be with Jesus. Last week, we talked about what, Dustin?
We talked about scripture last time, and there's so much to unpack. I feel like we left a lot on the table, but
Oh, absolutely.
we definitely had a good conversation regarding scripture and how that should be forming our life day in and day out, and some helpful tips also in part two. Just to keep in mind as we're going through scripture. So yeah, it was great. Excited about today too.
Yes. Today we're diving into the discipline of prayer. The discipline of prayer. And actually, Dustin and I were talking about the multiple different ways that we could dive into this topic and the multiple different things we could talk about. There's so much. But we're hoping to lay down a foundation for that today. And I'm sure it will lead to the opportunity in the future to have more conversations about this. Dustin, I mean, I'll just briefly say this. At Gospel Community where I pastor, I think I taught for 4 or 5 weeks. I think it was 5 weeks on prayer, based off of a book called A Praying Life by Paul E. Miller. And I could have spent way more time. Like that was like... we've even spent time in times past in our small group just diving into the little details about scripture and how it describes prayer to us and how we can learn from other people's prayers. Anyways, like it's just there's so much there.
Yeah.
Now
Even in scripture with like the Lord's Prayer, like you could just take 5 or 6 weeks on the Lord's Prayer.
Absolutely.
That's just one passage.
Now, this could be presented or described different ways, Dustin, and if you have a different definition, please feel free to share that as well. But one of the simple definitions that I have written down for a discipline of prayer is that prayer is the means by which we communicate with God. The means by which we communicate with God. Very simple, straightforward. Some might not like it that way or might present that differently. Only other note I'd say about that is that I like to point the disciplines back to Jesus as our example. It's kind of in the title of our idea here of the Master's Apprentice. Okay, so the Gospels show us that Jesus frequently spent time in prayer. He also spent times of extended prayer, including sometimes where he prayed all night. Like you see that like in Luke 6:12, for instance. And then he also taught the disciples a sample prayer. We just mentioned that, the Lord's Prayer, to help them with their prayer life. And so you have Jesus as the ultimate example of that in his communication with the Father. Would you define that any differently or want to point out any other nuances to that?
No, I think that's a great definition. I think we don't want to overcomplicate this.
Yes. That would be counterintuitive.
It would be. Prayer is simply talking with God.
Yeah.
And if we get away from that, we start getting into a little off of what we should be focused on. Because when we start talking about prayer and all of the different avenues, with prayer specifically, we're trying to describe... Gosh, my thought just left. Hold on. It'll come back.
You got this.
When we're talking about prayer, I guess just because of how I was brought up and with the whole checkbox kind of scenario of this is what you do to be a good Christian. Prayer was on that list. And it was typically described more or less as the genie in the bottle, if you will,
Right.
of coming to God and just asking him for things. And when you approach prayer like that, if you were to approach that with anybody, what kind of relationship is that when all you do is you just come to somebody and ask them for things, right?
Right, right, right.
it it's not really a relationship. It's a
Mm,
genie in a bottle. Or you come and you just ask, "Hey, can you do this for me? Can you do this for me? Can you help me here? Can you do this?"
right,
And if that's it, that is not communication. That's just a wish list
right,
and hoping Santa brings you presents under the tree kind of thing. You're like,
right.
so I want us to, I just want to make sure that we make it very clear that prayer is a two-way street,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
It's not this God. Part of prayer is asking God for things, but it's not all that it is.
Right.
And
And,
I
and
don't
that's
want
the
to like
same for relationships. If you're making that analogy of understanding it as
right,
a relationship, relationships will include you asking someone for help with something or when you need something. But if that's all it is, that's not a relationship.
right, exactly. And if we're going to be like Jesus and we're practicing this discipline, and part of this is helping us to be more like him,
Mm,
that has to be communication and a back
yeah.
and forth.
Yeah.
It's not you monologuing
Yeah.
or just asking for a wish list. This is part of growing.
Yeah.
And I don't have scripture for this. Um, at least I don't think I do off the top of my head. But if you look at Jesus and how he was always going to be alone with the Father and praying, and the little that
Mm,
we have in scripture of his prayers, it is not a monologue. It is him communicating with God the Father, right?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to make sure that right off the bat here that we don't go too crazy and start talking about prayer and, well,
Right.
you need to ask for things in faith and all of these like things we could talk about when it comes to
Sure.
that. And it's not that prayer isn't part of that, but
Right. Yeah.
communication with God is key.
Having a healthy understanding foundationally when we're talking about prayer. I actually heard another definition for prayer yesterday, right? To kind of push against this idea of God being like a genie, where you ask for some wishes from him. Um, it- Maybe even a better definition than the one I presented was prayer is about, I'm going to use the wrong word here because I'm going to say the word developing, but I think it might have even been the word fostering, might have even be a better word. But like prayer is developing a relationship with God.
Mm, yeah,
And so that communication with God as a means of developing a relationship with God. We understand this on a human level that our relationships are only as strong or as healthy or as good as we are able to communicate
yeah,
with one another. So
yeah,
when communication breaks down, that's when a relationship gets confusing or lacks understanding. So
yeah,
it's the same when it comes to our relationship with God. Is prayer is this gift from God to be able to communicate directly with Him, which we're encouraged to do as believers,
yeah,
and that He wants to have a conversation with us. He wants to have this communion, this fellowship with us through prayer, and that we should boldly do that.
yeah. And I, I know we're trying to do this overview. I don't know if this is going to sidetrack us or not,
We'll
but
find out.
I do feel like we should jump into this
Okay.
when we're talking about communication with God. I don't know how I know how you were raised, but I don't know in this specific way. When prayer was talked about in that way growing up about how it's communication with God, the sole focus was our communication to him.
Yes.
as
Same.
opposed to it being an actual two-way street.
Right.
It was very much focused on us talking to God and being in that rhythm, but there was no talk of God talking back to us.
Right. I think how it was even presented in many times was prayer is us talking to God as opposed to communicating with God, which is a different state,
Yeah.
which is why I said in the outset some people might not like my definition depending on their thoughts on this, but prayer, what was presented was prayer is talking to God and reading the Bible as God talking to us.
Yes.
That
Yes.
does that sound familiar
Oh,
to,
yes.
to you? So like
Yes.
that would be kind of a very generic or basic teaching that I learned at a young age, or was taught, I should say, at a young age. So yeah, oftentimes prayer is presented that way.
Yeah. And I don't know who's listening to this, but that may sound weird to you. It may
Yeah.
sound a little odd. Um, but as we go through all of these disciplines, because we've talked before about how there's overlap, you will find that if you get to a place where you can actually quiet your soul and your
Mm-hmm.
mind, and you can actually focus on talking with God, your Father, He will answer back.
Yeah.
And you've got to be still enough, quiet enough, which is goes back to us getting our the spiritual disciplines down. It's having a rule of life to make space
Right.
for that, right? So all of that's tied in together. So me saying that God talks back may be crazy to you, and it may be because your life is a whirlwind, and like who
Right.
has time to sit there and be quiet for 5 or 10 minutes, right?
Right. Right. And
But
go ahead.
yeah, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, sir.
Well, I was just gonna say, it may sound odd, but I'm telling you, coming from a place of practicing this, of more of a quiet, still prayer communication with God, I don't know how else to liken it other than my own, you know, mom and dad, like speaking to a parent, like just having that communication
Yeah.
back and forth, and him talking to me and speaking to me. There's a joy in that I cannot describe.
Right.
You almost have to
Absolutely.
experience it.
No, absolutely. And it's interesting because this is something that I've talked with another friend who is like, why don't we hear more teaching on this? Like practical teaching on this of like the listening part of prayer. And not that there can't be, but I think it's because part of it has to be learned in an intimate way
Yeah,
that it's really hard to give you practical tips on that, aside from the ones that we're going to give or will give on that.
yeah,
Like it's something, and for those that this kind of thing, if that makes you like uncomfortable or nervous, like, wait a second, what is this? Does everyone just going to like start having their own beliefs and everyone's just going to have, well, God told me that I'm supposed to,
right, right.
no, like, I'll just briefly say, because I don't want to sidetrack on this, is when we say that God can speak to us while we're in prayer, while communing with Him, is that He doesn't go against His word, His written word.
Exactly. Yeah,
And so that's why you have the Spirit and the Spirit's sword. And so the Spirit inspired the Scriptures. The Spirit's not going to tell you something from the Father different than what he wrote in the Scriptures. Like that's
right,
so
right.
we have a system in place to be able to judge accurately through Scripture, through the Spirit, and through community. These are ways
Yeah,
that we are careful of that overlap we've talked about before. So
yeah,
in as far as like the receiving from God in prayer, there's systems in place to do that in a safe way. as opposed to people that are just listening to inner thoughts,
Yes.
which is a thing. But only through the practice of it can you begin to better discern the difference.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't know if I just helped people or if I scared people more.
Well, I think that's something we'll definitely get into in Silence and Solitude, because
Yes,
that's a battle there.
absolutely.
But for now, if you're still here and you're listening and you haven't turned us off yet, um, if you're still here, just trust us on this and hang in there.
Yeah.
I tell my group, when we were walking through this, I had someone say, how do you know the difference between your thoughts and God? And I said, honestly, it's hard to tell you one way or the other. You just know. there,
Yeah.
there's a difference, and that sounds so arbitrary and just so nonchalant, but it's true. The
Yeah.
more that you practice it, the more you know.
Yep.
And I have scripture for that too. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they
Right.
follow me.
Yes. I mean,
So you know.
yeah. Part of it's learning God's voice. Part of that is learning yourself better. I mean,
Yeah.
because it'll eventually be really obvious when it's you.
Yeah.
Because you sounds a whole lot like you. Like that's
Yes.
like, if that's a fair way to put that.
Yeah, yeah. It's like, if I would say this here, then it's probably me.
Yeah. Right.
I did want to
That's
bring
good.
something else up here too. So when we're talking about prayer and that communication, I think when we get a little more practical and we can kind of back off of the two-way street here, but when we just talk
Yeah.
about prayer in general, time is an issue for most people. And I'm already super busy. Is 30 seconds or a minute or 5 minutes really going to make a big difference? And I heard a quote. I want to see if this kind of resonates with you. Um, all this is connected, so let me come to this. I feel like when I was growing up, and for a long time, even into college and early adult years, I felt like I was looking for God in the big things. And I'm very much reminded of, it's Elijah, when he he was after the prophets of Baal were defeated, and then Jezebel is hunting him down, and he runs and hides. You've got is it the whirlwind that comes by? You've got, I'm forgetting now, but there was a few things that passed by, and there were these big ginormous things, and then God spoke in the still small voice.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like growing up, I was always looking for God in the big things, like the big meetings, the big revivals, these like youth conferences where you're on this like emotional spiritual high, and like
Right.
God met us the last night, and like 500 people were
Right.
looking for God in those places. But I heard this quote, and I thought it was so good, by a guy named Tyler Staton. He said, we tend to miss God in our midst, not because he is too extraordinary, but because he is too ordinary.
Can you say
And
that
it's
again?
just,
I need you
yeah.
to hit it again.
We tend to miss God in our midst, not because he is too extraordinary, but because he is too ordinary. And I have found in my life, I'm looking for God in the big things and these big moments in life.
Yeah.
And I miss out on a lot of opportunities because he will meet you in the ordinary mess of life, the day to day, the getting up, getting ready for work, the trying to get the kids to school, trying to make dinner. all the ordinary moments in life, he's there.
Yeah.
He's not just in the big things. He is there in the small stuff. And I think sometimes when it comes to prayer, we think, what difference does this 30 seconds or this minute make? Because it's not going to make that big of a difference. But it does.
Yes. Yeah,
It's opportunities to communicate with God.
that would be my initial thought when you started this thought was, yes, it makes a difference whether it's, whether it's 30 seconds or 1 minute or 5 minutes of these brief moments of prayer that can happen throughout a day. Some of those moments are easier than others to pray in, but it's never wasted, and it does make a difference.
Yeah.
When you realize that you can pray anytime, anywhere, that's a game changer. If you think that prayer is for only in the morning, or only before a meal, or only before
Yeah.
you go to bed, or only at church, or only at your small group, or only at what, like, if that's
Yeah.
your idea of when prayer happens, man, you're missing out on a lot of opportunities to spend time with Jesus.
Yeah.
And it is, I mean, we do this now in a world of like cell phones, is we have short conversations with people all the time,
Yeah.
via text message or other ways of communicating through different apps. You have these brief encounters with people, brief conversations with people all of the time, and we don't think anything of it.
Right. Right.
You can also have those type of conversations with God, these brief interactions and brief moments. For me, and I'll hold back on this because maybe we'll talk more in part two about this specific thing. I know for me, Dustin, is in those most obvious moments of prayer for me, I too often text someone instead.
Hmm.
I too often call someone instead, or send, right? I, not because that is wrong,
Sure.
but looking back and go, man, that was an obvious opportunity for me to reach out to God.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's just kind of an encouraging thing as we're talking about this idea of prayer, is don't isolate it to certain times of the day. Once again,
Yeah.
creating structures where you're going to have time to pray that's set apart. I
Yeah.
absolutely would argue for that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is it's not only that.
Yeah.
You can pray anytime, at any moment, not just those set apart times.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll throw this out here too, and then Dustin, wherever you want to go from there, is like, if not just like prayer between you and God, but also praying for others.
Yeah.
Which, once again, that could be a whole other avenue of talking about. But like, someone's talking to you about what they're going through or what their current struggle is, and we go, "Oh man, that's rough." Maybe we don't even offer prayer. We just say, "Oh man, and that's a lot. We're thinking
Yeah.
about you." Or you might be nice and say, "Hey, we'll be praying for you on that." Or you could take that to the next level and say, "Can I pray for you now about
Yeah.
that?" And
Right.
I'd argue, once again, this crosses over into community. But when you bring prayer into community, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Like, this is acknowledging that in community, this is about God and what he can do in lives and what he wants to do in our lives. And my only regret in this aspect of community is I always wait way too long before asking someone to pray over me and pray for me.
Hmm. Yeah.
And there is something powerful about that, in even receiving that gift from somebody else. And so two things on that, right? Be ready and willing to ask for prayer, and be ready and
Yeah.
willing to pray for others. So that's another aspect of a two-way part of prayer. It's not just about your ability to pray, it's about accepting other people's prayers for you.
Yeah. I I'm sorry. I've been stuck on something you said earlier, so I
Uh-oh.
want to go
Did,
back.
did I say something wrong?
No, I can't I can't shake this because it was like kind of a gut punch as we're talking in
Mm,
real time. You were saying a second ago in the most obvious places of prayer that you tend to go to other people, right?
yeah.
And it was like I was sitting here thinking, like as you were talking, I was asking why do we do that? And I feel like God just gave me an answer. It may not be the answer for
Mm,
everyone, but because those are more real for us.
mm, mm-hmm.
You can go to someone and talk things out and have that communication, which just circles back to the fact that maybe our relationship with God is not in the place where we feel like that's more real than talking to someone else.
Right.
I was like, oh, that hurt.
Mm, mm.
um,
Dude, you could
it's
even word it like this. You could say maybe it's because when you text that person or, or however you communicate, right? You're expecting a response, but when you pray,
yeah,
you're not.
yeah, yeah. So if you find yourself in our shoes, because I feel like that's where I'm at, that just speaks to the fact that there's more work to be done on the communication and the
Yeah.
relationship with God, to where if you are in those most obvious points of prayer, you're not even hesitating. You're talking with God and saying, God, I'm struggling with this, and you just pour your heart out to him
Yeah.
and you're listening. Like it's just I wanted to circle back on that because I was just something I was thinking of in the moment, and just a word of encouragement to say that we're no experts in this field.
Right.
And we're still working through these things, and we don't have all of our stuff together.
Right.
And even as we're recording, God is speaking to us
Yeah. Oh,
and telling us
absolutely.
things. And just I know we got to go, so I don't want to belabor the
We
point,
do. We got to
but
start wrapping this up.
I think when it comes to this specifically, we know in our day to day relationships that seeking God in I'm not sorry, when in our day to day relationships, when we like for our spouse, for instance, how would things go if the only time we talked was on date night?
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Because that's when we're supposed to connect and have special time together and like yada yada yada, right?
Once again, a good thing.
Good thing, good thing. But if
But
all we do is talk during that time,
yeah.
we miss out on so many of the day to day moments, right?
Right.
And the same is true with God.
Yeah.
If you are looking for God in the highs of life, you're going to miss so many opportunities in the mundane, the ordinary, normal stuff.
Yeah. I want to add one last thing, and I hope it's not like too far off of our topic, but you mentioned something, and this is why it made me think of it, is you you talked about just kind of pouring yourselves out before God, like encouraging like honesty before God, like, here's where my heart is, here's where I'm at. Jesus, once again, is the perfect example of that. And in this case, you want to talk about honesty, is that Jesus knew the will of the Father. Jesus knew that the only way to accomplish his mission was to face the cross. And yet, what does he say? He says, Abba, Father, if it's possible, let
Yeah.
this cup pass from me. So, like, you have this moment from Jesus. He's going to do it. And he's not even, don't mistake it for a complaint, as much as in his humanity, the burden of this moment is so heavy hey, if there's another way to do this, but not my will, your will be done. So my point in saying that is this: if God has called you to a mission, he's called you to the thing that you're doing, and in the midst of that mission, you feel the weight of it, but you know you're doing what God has called you to do. Don't don't let that hinder you from being open before God. He already knows your heart. So just in your weakness, Father, I know this is what you've called me to.
Yeah.
But if there's another way to do this,
Yeah.
please, if there's another way to do this. But I know it's not up to me. It's your will. It's not my will. So that example of just when we're talking about being open before God and like this rawness, this pouring out before him, Jesus is a perfect example of that. And so don't be afraid or ashamed to present to the Father what's going on. Jesus wasn't. And then one last thing, if we can, I'd like to close out on this, Dustin, and then I'll swing it back over to you, is one of the quotes I'd shared with you before we got started from Paul Miller. Or I should say Paul E. Miller. I think that might be two different people. No. When you know that you can't do life on your own, then prayer makes complete sense. So if you're not at a point where it's like you realize that you need God for everything, you're probably not going to pray very much. But when he's brought you to a place where you understand, man, I can't do any of this without him, it will be really natural to want to pray. And I'll add to ask for prayer. So,
Yeah.
Any other thoughts there, Dustin, before we close this up?
Nope. I think that was great. I think
Awesome.
we hop right into part 2. Get a little practical.
Sounds good. Once again, there's a whole lot more we could talk about. Like we were just like scratching the surface, but I think that's enough for us to kind of think on for now and encourage each other with on that for now. We're going to wrap this up, and we hope you can head over to part 2 where we talk maybe even more practical and share how things are going for us in our prayer life. So hope you can see us over at part 2.